I'm going to talk about digital health technology and what we're doing at Richmond Research Institute, the Tele Monitoring study, but also some of the other studies that we are looking at. And as I said, thanks so much to Anne-Marie and Jack and to Eureka and York for letting me speak today. So the first thing is, Richmond Research Institute might be a bit of a mythical beast to some of you, and I just thought I'd explain a little bit about what we are and what we do and what the work is before I get into the digital health bit. So Richmond Research Institute is a non-profit academic research organisation. We have a few areas of interest, but predominantly around clinical trial safety, hepatology, diabetes care, and cardiac sciences. Our current work, of which I'll talk about some of these studies in more depth today, so we look at different areas of medical care. So there's a liver study looking at the moment, which many of you will be aware of, 1930, developing a score to predict non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and steatohepatitis. We do a lot of cardiac work and predominantly the Tele Monitoring study, and we'll talk about that effect in cardiac amyloidosis in length, but also some work in ECGs and AI, and we'll talk about that towards the end. As you know, Richmond Research Institute is quite interested in the effect of QTC and hyperglycemia, as well as lots of hormonal accesses in QTC prolongation and the implications in drug safety. And we've done a few studies previously, 1261, and we have further studies in the future looking at type 2 diabetes as well. We have a blood pressure study in its sort of earliest embryonic form, and we'll talk about that very shortly, using wearable monitors for clinical trial patients. And as you're all aware, we've done quite a lot at the Institute on COVID-19 and continue to do so through 2010, of which we're very grateful for lots of your participation. So, a word that I've had to practice saying, photoplethysmography. One of the studies that we're looking at is wearable blood pressure devices. So many of you will actually be wearing a PPG device right now. They're quite common. I thought this was really fascinating, so I thought I'd show it to you all. This is the first photoplethysmogram. It's a difficult word to say. Hertzmann pioneered it in 1937. Just to orientate you, this plate goes in your mouth. This is a light that goes up your right nostril. This is a mirror that goes up your left nostril. This contraption here is bitten between your teeth to hold it, and the light is shone across the nasal septum and then down into a photoelectric cell which generates a signal. And this was one of the first sort of examples of what we all know and recognize as pulse oximetry. I'm very glad that obviously it ended up on the fingertip and not in the nose. And actually Hertzmann was very proud of this invention, and he wrote in this paper, which I thought was fascinating, the entire assembly is mounted on a dental impression plate, which carried between the teeth not only provides a rigid mount, but also guarantees constancy of alignment with the nasal septum. The mirror and light tubes may be varied to fit varying areas, and any desired penetration is readily provided. The apparatus is light and comfortable and may be worn for hours without discomfort. Breathing through either the mouth or nose is especially feasible. So we can all be grateful that this didn't take off. But the principle is actually pretty much the same. So this is a modern device. This is the back of an Apple iWatch. You've got a light, a diode shining a slightly different wavelength of light into the skin. And then this is a type of PPG called reflectance type, where the reflected light is what goes into the diode. This is a transmittance type, but the principle is the same. The pattern and the signal gives you information about the blood flow in the tissues, essentially. Now, this technology is quite widespread. It's in Apple Watches, it's in Samsung, and we all recognize it as pulse oximetry, basically, which is infrared light. But lots of other wavelengths of light have been used to try and understand a little bit more about other biometric parameters. So heart rate is well recognized, obviously. Oxygen saturation we talked about, and blood pressure, which we'll talk about now. But also, coming down the line, and potentially in some devices at the moment, is the ability to monitor blood glucose levels non-invasively with optical devices. Lactic acid has also been tried in literature, and so has albumin. So this potentially could be a technology that might revolutionize a lot of the way we take clinical measurements. The study that we're looking at, which is titled 2103, is looking at wearable blood pressure devices in clinical trials. So the study design is to use one of these devices in 3 different settings, which are the sort of 3 validated settings of blood pressure measurement. So a typical office blood pressure measurement, which is a single sit-down monitor when you go to the clinic, which, as we all know, is quite vulnerable to white coat hypertension and other inaccuracies. And increasingly, the treatment of blood pressure is moving away from single measurements in terms of treatment-making decisions to longer-term measurements, which better reflect, as we saw in the previous presentation, the diurnal, nocturnal variation of blood pressure and how that affects actual outcomes. We want to compare it with ambulatory blood pressure. So many of you have also seen these devices. They're bulky traditional cuffs which you wear for 24 hours. They can be uncomfortable and can actually bias the results with also white coat hypertension. When it goes off, it's uncomfortable for the patient, which can elevate blood pressure. And again, we want to see if a passive device where you don't know it's taking your blood pressure is a better alternative or more accurate alternative. And the other area of blood pressure is the idea of home blood pressure monitoring, where patients take home a blood pressure device. They use that themselves, they record a diary, but again, that is very much reliant on the patient to be compliant, to keep good records, to bring those records to an appointment and to be able to make decisions on it. And a device which could link up with a smartphone or a central database, take passive blood pressure monitoring and then report back could be much more useful, much more accurate and keep a better compliance record. Down here are some of the devices that we've tried in our early feasibility analysis. So we've got the Samsung watch, of which actually you can't use the blood pressure in this country. The algorithms have not come in line globally. They're only available in certain countries. The Apple Watch, which currently doesn't have blood pressure, but possibly will have blood pressure analysis in 2022. The Actia device, which is a commercially available device, and so is the Asus Vivo watch. And the BioBeat, which is a not commercially available device at the moment, but has recently been published in Nature as a potentially quite accurate alternative, although it hasn't been validated. The difficulty here, and one of the big limitations of all these devices, is that they work essentially by monitoring relative changes in the signal, which means they all need to be calibrated to some degree, which actually is a major flaw in the design, depending on how you calibrate them. And certainly in our early studies, that was something that was very difficult. There is some work on calibration-free algorithms, and calibration-free algorithms could potentially revolutionize this space. If everybody could wear a blood pressure watch and it gave you an accurate measurement regardless of calibration, then that would be a big step forward, but it's not quite at that stage yet. The other big limitation with these devices, and probably why they haven't really stepped into the clinical sector in a big way so far, is that they are all essentially a way of monitoring the flow of blood. And as we're all aware, that can be affected by a number of different factors, the high viscosity of blood, anemia, edema, pregnancy, and also the actual pulse transit time is affected by arrhythmia, and it needs another element of monitoring the actual heart rate accurately and consistently to get a good blood pressure, which actually is a problem in traditional blood pressure measurement, which most people aren't aware of. For example, if atrial fibrillation, blood pressure monitoring isn't actually that good, but these are major limitations of this device, and whether or not they take off actually in the medical sector at all is one of the reasons that we sort of have this trial underway. Jumping to a completely different sector, as you'll notice from my talk, which jump all over the place, and jumping back to potentially the first talk, so we'll talk briefly about heart failure. So one of the big studies that we've been looking at, and some of you have been involved in quite in depth, is Tele Monitoring. But why are we doing this and why is it important? So the syndrome of heart failure probably affects around 1 million individuals in the UK and nearly 100,000 hospital admissions annually, of which around 30% of those will be what's known as heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, or HFpEF. And this costs the NHS every year at the highest complexity level of tariff, of which all cardiac amyloidosis patients certainly probably would fit, £6,500 per admission, or £650 million a year. So it's an extremely expensive problem. There are many causes of heart failure, including cardiac amyloidosis, or more accurately, cardiomyopathy. And actually, as a condition which I don't think we've mentioned, it is an extremely high-risk hospitalization condition. With the average patient, there's some data from the NAC that was published a few years ago to this effect, showing that around 60% of patients will be admitted to hospital annually from the year of diagnosis. And about 20% of those patients will be admitted 3 times or more. So it's a clearly very, very high-risk hospitalization condition, which might explain the very high volume of SAEs that we've had to deal with since dealing with this cohort. But despite all that, the maintenance of fluid balance is the mainstay of treatment. Telemonitoring, for those who've not heard that term before, is the practice of remotely monitoring intervention in patients and intervening. And in heart failure, actually, there's been non-invasive and invasive telemonitoring. Invasive telemonitoring using cardiac devices is quite widespread. Lots of pacemakers, for example, can monitor your thoracic impedance, and there have been trials of using that to guide fluid balance in patients, actually to mixed success. It can be quite oversensitive. But in non-invasive telemonitoring and different definitions of that, including just structured telephone support of heart failure patients, and this was a Cochrane review from 2015, which defined heart failure as left ventricular systolic dysfunction, or patients who are on any diuretics, so quite a broad group. A Cochrane review found actually a specifically non-invasive telemonitoring reduced heart failure admissions by 30% and all-cause mortality by 20%. Now that study's from 6 years ago, and clearly it's not something that's been widespread. So there's something to be explored with a practical application of this. So this brings me on to our second study that I wanted to talk about, and we've named it this acronym Pathway RCT, which stands for Preventing Admission to Hospital with ATTR Cardiomyopathy using Remote Cardiac Telemonitoring. A bit of a cheat there on the acronym. And this is going to recruit from 2022 with community ATTR amyloid patients, both wild type and hereditary, and the primary outcomes will be heart failure related hospitalization and cardiovascular death. So the two groups then, the first group will be undergoing usual care and they'll be advised to self-monitor, as any heart failure patient should be doing, they should weigh themselves every day, they should be given advice about when to react to fluid gain, and cardiac amyloidosis specifically, weight gains specifically, are rarely due to other causes such as fat and dietary changes, and most often due, especially in the acute stage, to fluid. And responding to those, the hypothesis is that we can keep patients out of hospital and potentially keep them alive for longer. So the telemonitoring arm, just a little bit more detail about how that protocol works. So it's a very protocolized sort of algorithm. Weights are performed daily on black box devices. Those devices are called body trace. We send them to the patient's home and they're connected to the mobile cellular network. So they don't need any Wi-Fi setup. They need absolutely no intervention from the patients themselves, which is very important because, as you're all aware, most of these patients are in their 80s and not particularly tech savvy. And then the weights are sent daily to the central database and the data management team, who then present it to the physician in a way that we can analyze the data and then flag patients who are deteriorating over a sort of acute or subacute time period. And then we contact them, alter their direct doses, or sometimes escalate their care if required, and then we will see if their weights are monitored and return back to baseline. And all of that sort of performed in a very algorithmic way. And we hope that in the next sort of year or so, we'll start recruiting these patients and trying to analyze this effect in the real world, which will be one of the few true RCTs, at least in cardiac amyloidosis, of telemonitoring. And actually in heart failure, there's been very few because it's not a particularly commercially lucrative project, but actually it might be very, very effective. And certainly some of the pilot data from our earlier trials over COVID have spoken to that. And to a third topic entirely, and to finish the topic, I think discussion of digital health technology would be complete without some chat about artificial intelligence. So I think we've all heard that term by now. It's a term that's pretty profligate in the world of healthcare space. But actually it's quite old. Machine intelligence has been around in some form for over 50 years. And for various reasons, there was this sort of AI winter, as it's described, where actually nobody was interested for a number of decades. So why is healthcare possible? So why has AI in healthcare become such a hot topic in the last sort of decade or so? And I think it's a combination of different reasons, sort of stars aligning. I think the first and most obvious thing is computational power. So if you compare what you all have in your pockets right now, it's technically a supercomputer by the standards of 30 years ago, and we've all got them and using them every single day. But the key thing probably is the fact that we have accessibility to very large data sets and have been recording large data sets on an absolutely massive scale globally for decades now. And it's the big data side of things that allows lots of these machine algorithm models to actually become accurate, become useful in the clinical space. The last thing is digital systems, and we are all much more digital savvy. The NHS is probably way behind the commercial sector in many factors, and digital certainly. And probably over the last 10 or 15 years, trusts have moved away from paper systems, and there are, I think, at least a few still on paper systems. But the more crucial part, and I suppose how I imagine at least clinicians and AI developing in the future, as opposed to being replaced, it will become a support tool. But the support tool requires human engagement, human trust, and the ability to work with algorithms in various different areas. So adoption is the key. And the combination of all of that means that this is probably going to be the age of AI, especially in healthcare, and various medical research has already started, and in some areas is already in clinical practice. So the main areas that artificial intelligence has made some sort of major breakthroughs that have been in the headlines in the healthcare field have been in medical imaging, chest x-ray analysis, diagnosis, lots of studies looking at physician and radiology supported decision making as opposed to AI decision making. And certainly in, well, I say my field, but in cardiovascular medicine, the use of AI in lots of the sort of advanced cardiac imaging, specifically coronary CT and MRI, to define lots of the tasks which are quite mundane and actually quite difficult to do, sort of drawing around coronary arteries, drawing around ventricles to define their size, are actually much better performed by AI algorithms, and they're already in clinical practice. Histopathology is again something, or as it's termed in the field, computational pathology, especially around cancer diagnosis, but not just diagnosis, also prognosis, grading tumours, and this idea that there's other factors that are invisible to the human eye that actually can be fed into a machine learning algorithm model and used to make decisions. And that would term the microenvironment. And actually we use this term called radiomics, which is this idea that you can get extra data, which is not necessarily data that the human brain can process, but can be fed into a machine learning model that then can actually make useful clinical decisions. There has been some reported data in use of AI and machine learning algorithms in drug interactions and flagging up dangerous drug interactions and predicting complex drug interactions with 1 or 2 or even 3 medications, and even in drug development. And that's actually quite probably one of the most advanced areas in the pharmaceutical sector of artificial intelligence-derived drug targets. And the major interest of many groups now, and there's lots of large studies such as Biobank, which are collecting huge amounts of data in longitudinal fashion, is using artificial intelligence and machine learning to process vast amounts of data, create new connections and predict disease in medical records. And the use of more and more electronic healthcare records, and the more, I guess, acceptability of us being willing to share our data and to develop those systems means that that will again become something that is screening, for example, for cardiac amyloid potentially, as an example, in the future might be something that is routinely built into a lot of electronic heart health records. So specifically, what are we doing at Richmond Research Institute in the area of artificial intelligence? Again, it's very much in its embryonic stage, but the 1930 study looks specifically at non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease affects up to 25% of the global population, so that's 1 in 4 of us in this room. And it's a spectrum of disease. It ranges from benign fatty liver, which doesn't really cause any pathological concern, all the way to inflammation of the liver, steatohepatitis, which is known as NASH, which can lead to liver cirrhosis, liver cancer, and liver failure. And NASH specifically has important effects, especially in clinical trials where it can specifically alter drug metabolism and the pharmacokinetics of new products, as well as pharmacodynamics and effects. And it can also be an important confounder of both safety in how we judge adverse drug events in patients who have NASH, especially liver reactions, and eligibility for entering trials. So the 1930 study overview then is all about trying to initially define, can we predict in clinical trial volunteers non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in a non-invasive fashion. We could, in theory, take a biopsy from everybody and see it, but that is impractical and also potentially unethical. So the 1930 study looks to recruit healthy patients and patients with known NASH, take a wide array of different biomarkers, so blood biomarkers, specifically liver function, but also other biomarkers that have been associated with fatty liver disease, insulin resistance, CRP and inflammation, triglycerides, cholesterol level. Body measures or anthropometric measures, including BMI and waist circumference. And then we also use another technology, which I haven't put in today's slides, and I probably should have, which is bioimpedance. And that's something that actually is used quite a lot in cardiac amyloidosis. And this is a great little, I don't know, emoji, I suppose, of someone using a bioimpedance machine, which I was fortunate to find. And essentially, it sends a very low voltage current through the body and gives you an idea of their body composition, which includes fat, skeletal muscle, extracellular water. And there's a lot of reasonably good evidence, and certainly in amyloidosis and Pastor Gilmore could mention some at the end, about predicting water content and heart failure. But in this specific study, using it as a measure of visceral body fat and overall body fat percentage is another important marker for fatty liver disease. We then take that data and we put it into a traditional multivariate logistic regression model to find the important factors, and then we derive a clinical prediction tool. And alongside that, we hope to use a machine learning model to see if we can make a better prediction tool that then could be used clinically to assess patients for fatty liver disease. So the future, obviously technology has a huge role, as we all are aware, in the future of healthcare, but how it's implemented, the ethics of that, the practicality of that, is I think something of a huge question mark. And Richmond Research Institute will continue to explore especially some of the areas and the projects that we have in the future of machine learning, looking at ECGs to predict future health events, and that might be adverse drug events or actually just any healthcare outcome over a long period of time, and that's potentially a very viable product with the amount of data that we have over the last 20 years. Using AI as a clinical trial decision support tool, and even looking at other studies looking at a big data effect of how food and health actually relate to each other, of which a lot of the studies lack a lot of objective basis and have a lot of bias in longitudinal effects. And now we have access to very large data sets of people's food buying habits, and how that links to health data might reveal some really useful and interesting new insights. And that's all the time I have. Thank you very much. And I guess I'll take any questions, or we'll wait for Q&A.